I wish to stop.
The Titanic, a boat that was considered unsinkable, yet its tragedy still lives on. The luxury British passenger liner, RMS Titanic began construction on March 31, 1909, in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, and was completed 3 years later in 1912. As one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, it was designed to be the largest luxury passenger ship in the world and would cost $7.5 million to build. It had a length of 882 feet, 9 inches, or 269.1 meters, a height of 175 feet, 53.3 meters, and a width of 92 feet, 6 inches, or 28 meters, and it weighed 46,328 tons. Below the waterline was the orlop decks for cargo, and the tank top where the engines, boilers, turbines, and electrical generators were. At the very top was the boat deck, where the bridge and wheelhouse were, as well as the lifeboats. In between were the decks for passengers with first, second, and third class cabins. The level of luxury was so high that second class was comparable to first class on any other ship. The 2,240 passengers would be from all walks of life, from millionaires and celebrities, to poor immigrants looking for a better life in America. Third class on the Titanic was significantly better than contemporary shipping standards, featuring private cabins, warm food, and shared social areas, yet it remained cramped and noisy. Housed on the lower decks, over 700 passengers experienced severe limitations on space, shared only 2 bathtubs, and were segregated by gender. The ship would act like a floating hotel, featuring a grand staircase which allowed first-class passengers to move from deck to deck and had a dome skylight to allow natural light in. The ship also featured a gymnasium, dining saloons, a reading room, a barber shop, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and a swimming pool. The ship carried 20 out of a possible 64 lifeboats. Therefore, there were only enough for half the ship's population. However, this was within legal requirements. Lifeboats were only intended for carrying passengers to rescue ships, and not keep the entire ship population afloat. As a result, the company who owned the Titanic, White Star Line, felt complacent enough to keep the number of lifeboats low so the deck wasn't cluttered. Many claimed the Titanic was unsinkable because its hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. It was said that if up to 4 of these flooded, the ship would still stay buoyant. All of these qualities drew the press to frequently talk about the new passenger liner. In the morning of April 10, 1912, passengers began boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England, with large crowds gathering to watch the ship depart. At noon the Titanic set sail under command of Captain Edward Smith, beginning her maiden voyage. It would stop at Cherbourg, France, and then Queenstown, Ireland, to pick up more passengers, and then began its journey across the North Atlantic Ocean towards New York City. The voyage of the RMS Titanic was calm and comfortable, with smooth seas and passengers enjoying the ship's luxury. On April 14, 1912, warnings were coming in of icebergs from other liners, so Captain Smith had plotted a new course and continued to steam at full speed, which was standard practice. As it became dark the temperatures were dropping to below freezing, and there was no moonlight, or waves, making it difficult to see approaching icebergs. At 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the ship's lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg from the crow's nest. He rang the warning bell and telephoned the officers at the ship's bridge, shouting, "Iceberg, right ahead." Fleet had spotted the iceberg with his eyes, as the crow's nest binoculars were locked away. The key's owner, Officer David Blair, had been removed from the Titanic's crew at the last minute and forgot to hand over the key. The officers on the bridge quickly turned the ship away from the iceberg, but it was too late. The Titanic grazed the iceberg along its side, ripping several holes in its hull below the waterline with fragments of ice hitting the deck. At first everyone felt relief, the lookouts, and the passengers didn't even feel the collision. 11:50 p.m. Captain Smith and the ship architect, Thomas Andrews, went to inspect the damage. They knew the ship would start sinking, and by this time, 6 of the watertight compartments at the ship's hull were already breached and began flooding. In those first moments after the iceberg strike aboard the RMS Titanic, many passengers barely noticed anything unusual. First-class passenger Margaret Brown later recalled that the stop felt like little more than a gentle jolt. Others, like Lawrence Beasley, described a slight vibration rather than a crash. Some passengers even went on deck out of curiosity, where they saw chunks of ice scattered about and treated it almost playfully, unaware of the danger below. Meanwhile, in third class, the impact was more noticeable for some, especially those in the forward sections where the iceberg struck, as they heard a scraping noise and felt a stronger shudder. At 12 a.m., the captain sent out a distress call over the radio in the hopes that there were other ships nearby, and gave the order for the Titanic's passengers to board the lifeboats. He knew there were only enough for half the population of the Titanic. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent urgent distress signals as stewards began waking passengers. Many first and second class passengers were calmly escorted to the decks, but in third class the situation was far more confusing. Passengers such as Charlotte Collier described not being clearly told what was happening, only instructed to wait or move between areas, which delayed their escape and increased anxiety. At 12:25, the lifeboats began their loading, with women and children first as this was the protocol at sea. Many passengers still did not understand what was going on, and confusion and disorganization meant that the first lifeboat to leave had only 28 women and children aboard when it could carry 65 people. First Officer Murdoch took the order to mean women and children first, then men if they were there, while Second Officer Lightoller took it to mean women and children only. However, the only Japanese passage on the Titanic, Masabumi Hosono, had a different plan. Hosono was asleep when the crash happened, but awoke when a stewardess knocked on his cabin and told him a life jacket. When he tried to go to the top deck where the lifeboats were, he was blocked by a crewman, who assumed he was a third-class passenger. But eventually he slipped past, and reached the top deck. All the while flares were signaling emergency were being shot into the air ceaselessly, and hideous blue flashes and noises were simply terrifying. Somehow I could in no way dispel the feeling of utter dread and desolation. He found a lifeboat, when an officer shouted room for 2 more, and survived the Titanic disaster. When he returned to Japan, Hosono, instead of being cheered, was disgraced by US and Japanese press, because he did not adhere to the women and children first rule. He was fired from his job and portrayed to the media as dishonorable coward who pushed other passengers out of the way to reach the lifeboat's seats. Some newspapers even wrote stories about Hosono disguising himself as a woman to get on a lifeboat. For third-class passengers, reaching the lifeboats was especially difficult. The ship's layout and partial barriers meant many had trouble finding their way to the upper decks in time. Some corridors were confusing, and language differences made communication harder. Families were separated in the chaos. Meanwhile, in first class, some women refused to leave their husbands. Ida Strauss chose to remain with Isidor Strauss, while others like Margaret Brown were urged into lifeboats even as they hesitated. The Carpathia, which was 58 miles away, heard the distress call and began sailing towards the sinking Titanic to rescue the passengers. Aboard the RMS Carpathia, Captain Arthur Rostron pushed through dangerous ice. On Titanic, passengers like Eva Hart later remembered the rockets lighting the sky. In third class, however, many didn't see these signals at all, as they were still trying to reach the boat deck or waiting below, uncertain of what was happening. By 1:00 a.m., with the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the water's surface. Water was pouring in 15 times faster than it could be pumped out, which was not helped by the fact that many of the passengers had left their portholes open. Now it's 1 a.m. With the lower decks flooding, the bow of the ship began to sink below the water's surface. Water was pouring in 15 times faster than it could be pumped out, which was not helped by the fact that many of the passengers had left their portholes open. The unsupported stern and its propellers rose out of the water into the air. Panic and chaos set in. As lifeboats were running out, some people pushed their way to the lifeboats, while others accepted their fate and stayed behind. Some gave up their spots to more vulnerable passengers. Many did not want to survive the disaster and be branded a coward back home. As the tilt became obvious, conditions worsened dramatically, especially for third-class passengers, many of whom were in the lowest parts of the ship where flooding began first. Water entered their cabins earlier, forcing them to move quickly through crowded passages. Some survivors reported gates and barriers slowing movement, while others simply became lost in the maze-like interior. Above deck, the band led by Wallace Hartley continued playing, and survivors like Lawrence Beasley described the music as calm and haunting. Meanwhile, Benjamin Guggenheim chose to face death in formal attire, reflecting the stark contrast between calm acceptance and growing panic. By 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat had left, but 1,500 people were left on the ship. The deck was now at a steep height, and many passengers fell into the freezing icy waters. By this stage, many third-class passengers had only just reached the deck, or never made it at all. Survival rates for third class were much lower, largely due to delayed access and distance from lifeboats. Those who did reach the top faced the same steep, slippery decks as everyone else. Charles Jockin later described, clinging to the stern as others fell, or jumped into the freezing sea. At 2:17 a.m., the captain announced every man for himself. The stern gave way under the pressure and broke off, with the front half disappearing to the bottom of the ocean. At some point, Captain Smith went down with the ship, a maritime tradition that the captain would do in accepting responsibility for all on board. Some say he went to the wheelhouse and waited for the end, while others say he committed suicide using a pistol. In the final moments, class distinctions largely disappeared as everyone struggled to survive, but the earlier disadvantages had already taken their toll. The band was still playing, according to survivors, even as the ship broke apart and lights failed. The stern smashing into the water surface became level and sewers started to fill with water, sinking nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean. Many died as a result of drowning, but the main cause of death was hypothermia in the freezing waters, which occurred within minutes. Some of the lifeboats returned, but only 4 survivors were found. At 3:30 a.m., the distress flares from the Titanic were spotted by the Carpathia. The Carpathia arrived to the scene at 4:10 a.m., and picked up the lifeboats. Only 705 passengers would survive the disaster, with over 1,500 people losing their lives. When the Carpathia arrived, survivors faced the devastating reality that a large proportion of those lost were from third class. The tragedy of the sinking of the RMS Titanic was not only the scale of loss, but how unevenly survival chances were distributed among those on board. After this, all passenger ships were required to carry significant amounts of lifeboats for passengers on board.